So the pieces of geraniums that are on the table are yours for the taking if you want them. If you have a special one that you like and somebody else grabbed it, why, talk to me and we'll go out and cut another piece off. Fortunately, those all along this right-hand side of the hall here did not get frosted, but I think it's because when we did have the frost, that the sun doesn't hit those until late afternoon, so it didn't phase them at all. And look at them, they're growing up 5 feet high. So, and they are beautiful right this time of the year. So, let's get on with our program. And I would like to introduce to you Wil Atchinson, who's going to talk to us and whatnot about the Ryan and Atchinson family.
It was in 1928. I was born in 1927, but my father and mother didn't bring me there until they brought me in a wash basket. That was the same year that a fellow named Walter Monroe Brockway came to the ranch as a temporary employee of my grandparents. He was an ex-pug from New York City who once fought Joe Jeanette, who was a lightweight champion of the world. And his aunts were Episcopalian nuns, and they didn't know he was fighting, but in New York, when they played up the fight, they saw brochures or placards on a wall and realized it was their nephew who was fighting for the world championship, and he ran away from home and came to California. Just want to bring Walter in there because he was part of our family practically. He came, as I said, temporary help, and he lived with my grandfather and my grandmother until they had passed away in the 60s, my grandfather did, and Walter passed away in the late 60s and lived there until the house was abandoned upon his death. And he was the last one to be at the Atchinson residence, so I wanted to bring that up because some people remember Walter. He was sort of a fixture to the family, as I say, and a handyman, and he would go down to the pubs down in Clayton every once in a while and imbibe with a little too much fire water and created some excitement in Clayton, and get him home and put him back in his bed.
What was his last name?
Brockway, Walter Brockway, and people used to call him Walter, but a lot of them called him Brock. And the Blockings were good friends of his, and he had a lot of friends. I have fortune of being two early pioneer families into Clayton for my ancestry. First, as you know, my great-grand-uncle Charles Bryan was a co-founder of Clayton with Joel Clayton. In fact, the story that goes around is when they wanted to name the town, there was a coin flip. And the choice was to flip the coin to be called Clayton or Rhinesville. Well, they flipped the coin and Uncle Charlie lost and it became Clayton. But many years later, about 20 years ago, at the Camellia Tea, I met Mrs. Callahan, who was a granddaughter of Joel Clayton, and she told me a story that her grandfather told her, and she said they shouldn't have said Rhinesville or Clayton, they should have called the town Watermelon because there were so many rhymes around. The reason being so many rhymes, Uncle Charlie had 13 children, and my great-grandfather Jacob had 14 children. So between the two men, they had 20, that gives you what, 27 children, so there are a lot of rhymes. My grandmother was the first.
Can you speak a little more into the mic?
I certainly will.
Turn it a little bit.
With my loud, crazy voice, I didn't think I needed it, but I'll do that. So
Thank you.
you bet. My grandmother was the first child born to Jacob Ryan. He had two daughters before that, and she was born in Clayton in 1880. She was educated at the two-room schoolhouse, as most of the other children were educated at the two-room schoolhouse. The older boys were made to play musical instruments, take music and to do all the things that young men in those days did, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And one of them played the musical instruments and led the 4th of July parades with the bugle. Someone asked me, what about that bugle that's at the museum? Yes, that was the same bugle that was used, that was donated by my father 15 years ago, I guess. So that's still there. My grandfather Jack was born in Illinois in 1874, and he was about 6 years older than my grandmother. As I said, she was born in 1880 in Clayton. In 1890, the Atchinson family moved west. And prior to that, however, my great-grandfather, you've seen some of the pictures down here, particularly those home shots of my great-grandfather George. Before that, he came west twice. He came out with wagon trains leading as a scout and so forth for the wagon trains to California in his youth. And there's a lot of misinterpretations about how they came west in those days, because if you watch the Western movies, everybody jumped on a covered wagon and you rode the horses and it was pretty good. Well, he didn't say it was that good. The only guy that got to ride was the guy driving, and those who were sick got in the wagon. Because when you left the Midwest or you left the East, all your goods and all the property you wanted to take, you had to put in the wagon. There was very little room to put people in the wagon. Because if Mom wanted to go and she wanted to ride the wagon, she'd have to leave the clock home. Maybe she wanted the old family clock, so she had to walk with the kids. The kids and the women and everybody walked west, and from Iowa, it took 4 months to go from Iowa to Virginia City. And of course, they sat in Virginia City waiting for the winters to pass. By the time you got to the snow-starved mountains, which, as you all remember, the Donner Party didn't do. But it was a very tough and hard trip, and it wasn't like the movies at all. He went back home later, and in 1890, he came west with his family, and they were married, by the way, in Fulton County in 1871, and they had 4 boys. Some of the pictures are here of Alonzo, John, Art, and George Jr. When they got here in 1890, my great-grandfather said would have bought more land, but he bought about 50 acres in the old site now, which is on Clayton Road. But the reason he didn't buy more land, he thought he was getting robbed, and he was paying an outrageous price of $35 an acre. I wonder what he'd think if he was here today. They later moved up onto the site, which where some of you people have asked me, Atchinson Stage Road is, and that's about the center of the property that we had, the 50 acres. It was on the south side of the road. And in 1893, that's when they built the house. Now, the house was 100% redwood. They didn't know how to build anything in California hardly in those days, but it was all local redwood. They did not build foundations. They took stones and they made sort of a square the size of the house they were going to build, and they stacked all the stones there, and then they just set the redwood logs the way they wanted to put the house and size it in there, and set them on there, and the weight of the house itself sat on those rocks and just held it there. And that did a pretty good job, because that house stayed until 1960s, the end of the 60s, and there was only one major crack in the whole house, and that was in the fireplace, and that was caused by the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. The rest of the house didn't have any cracks or anything in it, so it didn't really settle any different than houses today, maybe even held up a little bit better because of the resilience. The house stood, as I mentioned to you, until the 1960s, and then we had a fellow named Bob Roberts auction off the lumber in the warehouse, and the one thing that I regret today he auctioned off was the old stagecoach. It was a 3-seater stagecoach that was auctioned off. It was out in the barn. The ranch was there, as I said, on the south side of the highway, and today, some of you people may not know it, they call it the Jeffries Ranch out there. Thank you. Yeah, that's wrong, because Jeffries, they didn't come here till after I came here. They came here about 1928. But they had the property on the north side of the highway, and that was a Jeffries ranch. But in the 1960s or 1970s, when they were merchandising it, they had their name there, and they started on the Jeffries ranch. Had some success. We sold our property. They took that property and they just incorporated it into their program, and then it all became known as the Jeffries Ranch. The one thing they did do, thank goodness, is that they did name some streets after our family, so we do appreciate that. The property, after Walter passed away, as I said, became vacant. The Highway Patrol contacted us and asked us if we would please do something, because that was about the time of the hippies. And the hippies were coming in and they were getting into the old house and they were sleeping there and starting fires and all kinds of situations. So they asked us to do something and get rid of the property. So we called Bob Roberts, and we told him that if he could get rid of it, we'd appreciate it. He did run an auction. They dismantled the house and sold the redwood. And I'm sure a lot of people need to advise that there was a lot of memorabilia in the house, and at the time, most of us in the family, we just thought it was like, well, someone said something earlier to me today, you know? When Grandma had a beautiful oak gold table, this is not my grandma, this was someone else's, here was saying, her grandma had this beautiful old oak table that was in the family for years, but about that time, she wanted a new table, and they went out and they bought a nice Formica and chrome table and replaced that. And Grandma was so happy that they got that. Now you think back and you say, my God, there's like that old table. And that's what we did. We had a lot of memorabilia, and you know, it's like we buy junk and we sell antiques, so the stuff didn't look too good to us, and so forth. And as I say, regret the old stagecoach being sold, and I wish I had it today. But then again, when you look back at that was about the time I was married. I didn't even have a car. What the hell was I going to do with a stagecoach? You see me riding in San Francisco saying, "Giddy up," you know. So you look back in retrospect and you miss those things, and that's the one thing in my life I wish we'd kept. It was just a wonderful thing. And anyway, Bob got rid of everything. Some lady, and it might have been Mrs. Roberts who called, and a lot of this memorabilia were things I guess that Bob took home, put in the garage, and was sitting there. And she got tired of the junk, and she called Dick and said, "Come get this stuff." And that's why we have a lot of these pictures. And I think there's a lot of things here that I can't answer who they're from, if they're from our family or not, and maybe other things also. A little story about my grandparents. My grandmother was underage when my grandfather fell in love with her. He eloped with her. My great-grandfather, Jake, he saw that was stopped and sent somebody down and brought him back. They got home. By God, they eloped the second time. They got nailed again. And then they went the third time, and my grandmother's cousin, Abraham, was sent down again. He found them, and he called the police, and my grandparents spent their honeymoon, their first night in jail in Berkeley. I got a little article here that's sort of a kick out of one of the old papers, because it says, "The bride had been working in the city for 6 weeks in a crockery store in Market Street. Atchinson, until a few days ago, was employed in a dairy in Contra Costa County. He came to the city Friday and obtained a license to marry. The couple went to Oakland yesterday and were married by the Justice of the Peace Cliff. They then returned to the city and took apartments at the Yosemite House. Abraham Ryan, a cousin of the girl, came to the city on the request for the purpose of preventing the marriage. He learned that the couple were, and calling the policeman, told him that the couple had eloped. Mr. and Mrs. Atchinson were taken to the city prison where they proved that they were married. The bride had no objection, but Constable Chapman had to take her back to her parents."
What year was that?
1898. 1898 they were married. My grandfather, some of you know, maybe some of you don't, he was the last stagecoach driver in the area. His name was Jack, as I mentioned earlier, and then he had a younger brother, George, and my grandfather drove the stage from Clayton to Martinez, and George drove it from Clayton to Antioch. You have to remember, Clayton was a pretty good city in the county at that time. It was the hub of the coal mining business, because up above, as the coal mines were in operation in those days, there was a lot of commerce going on. And they weren't as sophisticated as we are today. We have daylight savings. But my grandfather would get up. Summertime wasn't too bad, I guess, but he would talk about the winter times, and he'd get up, be dark, and he'd have to get the horses and do whatever you do to a horse to get him on a stage. I guess you don't saddle him up, but I guess you get all the gear on him. And he would do that, and then he'd get the horses hooked up to the stage, and then he would drive to Martinez, and then in Martinez he'd do his errands and deliver the mail, pick up passengers and do what he had to do, and then he would turn around with another team of horses and come home. And when he got home and undid the horses, it was dark again. So traveling was not too quick, as you can see. It was a long time hitching and unhitching the horses.
Where was the stagecoach station?
Beg your pardon?
Where was the stagecoach station located in Clayton?
Gosh, I couldn't tell you exactly where the barn was. It might have been our barn. I doubt it probably left from in town, because after all, we were half a mile out of town, and that was a long walk even in those days. There were no streetcars, you know, so probably was right down in town.
Right on top of it.
Well, could very well be. I don't know.
Could very well.
Yeah. On his trip to Martinez, he'd always talk about, and there's some articles in here, I'm going to read a short one here from one of the papers. They do it much better and quicker than I can get to it. But going through Pacheco, which was low and is still low, and they have floods there, and they used to have great floods about the turn of the century. The horses in the wintertime would have to swim quite often across there. But Pacheco became known to one of my relatives, my aunt in particular, when she was a little girl, and she kept hearing the word Pacheco and the city of Pacheco. They use the word city, I guess, it's not too much at that time. But she always wanted to go to Pacheco, and she drove my grandfather and my grandmother crazy. She always wanted to go on the stage and see this town of Pacheco. She was about 4 or 5 years old. My grandfather said, "Okay, sis, you're going to go on the stage, and we're going to go to Pacheco." So he took her on his run to Martinez, and went in, and he came back, and again, the day was fine, except when he brought the horses back, and she came back. She ran into the house, she was crying and bawling. My grandmother couldn't figure out what was going on. My grandfather came, my grandmother said, "Well, what's wrong with sis? What's going on? What did you do? Did you whip her? Did you beat her? What happened?" She's just up crying and bawling her eyes out. He says, "I don't know what's happening." So they both went up to the bedroom, and they said, "Sis, what's wrong? You're crying, you're all upset." She said, "Because Papa promised to take me to Pacheco, and I never saw Pacheco." She went through it and didn't even know it. He just didn't point it out to her, I guess. And we kidded her till she was 85 years old, I guess, before we stopped teasing her about Pacheco. And whenever we went down to the Martinez Gun Club, we'd always say, "Remember, sis, keep alert, we're going through Pacheco." Another story that remember Judge Garamendi told me about my grandfather when he was a stage driver. He liked him very much. It was because when he was a young boy going to the grammar school, it was a grammar school in Concord, which was a parochial school, and he had to walk into school and walk home out to Clayton Road all the time. It was quite a walk for a kid in grammar school. But he built a fine friendship and fascination with my grandfather, because my grandfather couldn't let him ride in the stagecoach, but in the afternoons when he was coming home, Judge Garamendi was a little boy. My grandfather would stop the stage next to him because he sort of waited for him, and he'd let him sit on the step, and he'd ride back home on the step of the stage. And he thought that was pretty good. Thought my grandfather was a pretty good Joe to to wait for him or to come along and let him ride on the stage so he didn't have to do that long walk. I mentioned that the Ryan family had 13 and 14 children, respectively. And the Atchinson family, there were the 4 boys. The funny thing about that in Clayton, and I don't know where they all moved to, but they all left Clayton. Of the 13 Charlie Ryan descendants, the 14 Jacob Ryan descendants, they all left save one Ryan, and that was my grandmother Hilda. And of the 4 boys that were Atchinsons, the 3 others left, and my grandfather stayed there. And they were the only 2 that stayed in the area. They became, however, a focal point for the family. And I can remember in the 1930s and the 1940s that we would have huge amounts of people on the weekends. My grandmother's brothers and sisters, my grandfather's brothers would come up, and they would have these huge, up the back, huge barbecue pit, and they would barbecue a whole lamb on a day, and barbecue all kinds of food. I remember those things. And they tell me that in the 20s it was even worse. There were more people and more food than ever, but that was a focal point for the whole family. My grandfather had a hobby, and some of you may remember that if you were young going by there, but we had about 40 or 50 cages, and he raised and breeded birds. He loved to hunt, he loved to fish, he loved birds, and we had all kinds of golden pheasants, silver pheasant, Chinese pheasant. We had all kinds of doves that came from all over the world. He traded eggs with other people, but we had about 40 cages back there that he had all these different exotic birds that we kept, and he and Walter would have to clean the cages all the time. Together they did a heck of a job, and they had a wonderful time. I was going to read that, and if I may just take a second to skip over this, I'll read the whole article, but this is the only bad man on the old stage driver was that he met a woman. This is my grandfather's picture that he was interviewed in when he was about 8, well, he was 82 when this was done. So he said, when John was driving stages, there was always, well, let me just go, I'll start a little sooner because this might be in the news. When John was driving stage, he says there were only 7 houses all the way from Clayton to Concord. From Concord to Martinez, where he met the train was a wide channel running into what is now an area of fine new homes near Pacheco. I had the coach specially built. Bart Nels in Pacheco charged me $125 for the outfit to get it through the channel. Water stood 4 to 5 feet deep in flood season and ran a strong current. Many a time I had to swim the horses, riding the coach along the road as best I could, sitting on the mail to keep it dry. Well, this day I had 3 drummers and a lady passenger from the run back from Martinez. I'd made it through back to Concord, but this lady didn't have much confidence. She stood up on the back of the coach, beat me in the head to get me to stop, and the two men had to sit on her to hold in the seat so she wouldn't fall out and drown. But I put her down in Concord, and she cussed me out and said, "You blasted whippersnapper, I'll never ride with you again." And I told her I'd never insist on that. He had seen many changes since he put the fancy 3-seater coach in the barn for the last time. He said there were 3, and this is, continue on because this is about Clayton here. There were 3 coal mines running, and Clayton was a boom town when he was driving stage. Even during Prohibition years, when Eastern buyers were giving $115 a ton for California grapes. Clayton was pretty lively. When grapes dropped to $10 a ton, walnut orchards began replacing vineyards. Now subdividers and commuters are pushing the pretty Diablo hillside country around Clayton, and the old-timers like Jack Atchinson are sawing up the old walnut logs for firewood. That's all I can tell you about the last of the stagecoach, he said. So that's about the end of my story, and articles, and I have a picture here I was going to give to, but I was hoping that
Lucy Vieira.
Lucy Vieira would be here, because I have a picture of the whole student body, USC student body. This is the student body of Clayton School in 1914. My father and my aunt are in here, and Lucy is, I'm sure she's in there, because when I mentioned the last time I talked to your group, she asked about my aunt, and they were classmates, friends. But and Principal Graves' picture is in here, and I understand somebody says they have this cloak or something.
His frock coat.
So I'll give this to the museum, this picture from 14, because I did have the roster that I gave you the last time. I just found this picture. Anybody have any questions, I guess? That concludes my my discussion on the whole thing. Beth?
I have a memory of your grandfather, I think, telling me that he delivered the mail in Clayton at least once in a row.
The creek flooded. The creek flooded.
It seems unbelievable to me, but could the flood have been such that he could get down to here?
That I couldn't answer. I've never heard that in the play.
He came up the creek.
Maybe it's my imagination, but I don't know why I made that up.
I don't know. It could happen. Look at what happened in the Central Valley this last summer. Who knows? They might have had a great flood around, and the creek might have come up high enough that, it doesn't take a couple of feet. You have to get across the street with it. Anyway, I don't know. I've never heard of that. Yes?
What happened to the stagecoach?
I really don't know. Didn't even come up for the auction to see who bought what. There were all kinds of items, but I don't know who bought what. Don't know whatever happened to the stagecoach. It was not a stagecoach like you would see in the movies where they're going across Texas, Of course, in the movies, the horses run for 8 hours. I mean, you ever think if anybody owned a horse in the stagecoach, they start out at the stage, and the horses go, and then 8 hours later, they're coming into San Antonio, and the guys go, oh, my God, Dallas to San Antonio, nonstop. But the stagecoach looked more like a Surrey. It had 3 wooden seats across, which held 2 or 3 people in width, not as wide as an automobile seat, but there were 2 or 3 seats wide back. And then it was open, and then it had a top, and then it had fringe all the way around.
Sorry.
And behind the 3rd seat was a spot, and I presume, because having looked at it when I was a kid, pretending I was a stage driver, that the mail sat under the 3rd seat. I'm sure if there weren't enough passengers, mail sat on the seats or wherever it was, depending upon the amount of mail. But it was more like a 3-seated Surrey that you saw in the movie Oklahoma, that kind of with the fringe on top.
Yeah.
Leather seats too. But I don't know if it had isinglass curtains or rolled. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I remember Earle Duncan telling us how Hilda Ryan climbed out of the bedroom window to elope. I don't know which elopement that was.
Well, I don't either, because they had, as I mentioned, they had 3 elopements. The 3rd one finally took. I'm going to tell you something else. I didn't know about that until a long time. I got some of these articles that I inherited some way through the family and talk about these things. But I just want to mention one thing, because I didn't know about it at the time. But in 1949, I eloped with this lady here. Nothing written here about it. I'm just telling you. And this is my wife, Marilyn, by the way. We eloped in 1949, and we were married some years. And then, I don't know, it was probably about 10 years later, my grandfather mentioned that they eloped. And they said it wouldn't last.
Okay.
Yes, Bob?
Mr. Roberts that you were talking about lived on Lydia Lane, right next to Joe Swice's.
Right.
And he passed away about a year ago.
Oh, sorry, to that.
He was always very interested in history and things. And there's a picture of him there with Al Lyman in the newspaper, giving the 4th of July banner to Al. He found that 4th of July banner, I think, somewhere in the Atchison house or
Was in the
barn.
barn.
Yeah, yes, I remember, because I remember when the 4th of July banner was given, that's when my dad decided to give the bugle to the museum. He gave the bugle, my dad gave the bugle that year, and he also gave it, he cried, I remember, in front of the museum, because he gave all my grandmother's school books and all her writings when she was little, 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 2 is 4, and they used to keep little books.
Little books.
And he had all those, and he gave them, and Connie has those in her possession now. It was quite touching for my father to give those away.
Well, just so everyone knows that, I didn't realize that Mr. Robert just passed away, but it must have been the fall of last year that his wife, widow, brought this box in, which contained all of this that you and I then looked over, and which is on display here, but it was stored in their garage up in the lat point. She felt the museum was the best place for it, which we were thankful for. And the other thing too is that the stage with the Surrey appearance and so on. We'll keep looking in the Contra Costa Times. They have about 20 photographs, copies of, that they put in, on that Thursday when you get your little supplement in the Contra Costa Times. But one of those, which both the Times, the transcript, and an advertising agency the other day, they saw that and they grabbed it right away. So it's something that's going to be seen by the public, I think, in the next several months, which is nice.
That's very good.
Which is nice. Yeah.
There's one of the books, I don't know if you have it out here, you got some books with a picture of my grandmother in an old fire engine.
Yes, I think it was, probably the old Clayton book or whatever.
Yeah,
we
one
did,
of those magazines out there,
Yeah.
books out, they have a picture of my
Yeah.
grandmother. She's a little thing, she wasn't even 5 feet tall.
Were those pictures that you had loaned to the school to photograph, or did somebody come?
I don't know where those.
I don't
some
think
of those
we have
pictures
that,
Came
yeah.
around, you got some pictures here I've never seen. You got
Oh.
a picture of my grandfather in
Yeah,
a wagon.
right.
I've never seen that one
Okay.
before, to my knowledge. You have, by the way, that larger picture that you have is in color, and I don't know how they color, but that's about 20 years older than the other picture, and that's my great-grandfather. So that's probably right after the house was built sometime,
Yeah.
because I was looking for that other old picture I found, and what I was looking for, someone mentioned to me a little bit earlier, I was looking for the lilac trees in front of the house, and none of those pictures show those.
Yeah.
And my grandmother had about 4 big lilac bushes, and when they bloomed, people used to stop in the highway and take pictures. They were absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Tell about the parrot.
Renata was reminding
Oh.
us about the parrot.
Oh, so you want to hear about the parrot? Well, one of my grandmother's brothers got an old, I think his parrots lived to be over 100 years old in some instances. And one of my great uncles, my grandmother's brothers, got a parrot from a Spanish sea captain in San Francisco and brought it out to the ranch. And that parrot lived for a long time. And she was behind, and she was almost like a human being. One of the stories I was telling this lady about this, that Walter was from New York, as I mentioned. He was sort of, he was an ex-pug. Things had to be done properly. And during the day, you had breakfast, dinner, and supper. Lunch meant you had a sandwich or something like. But working on the farm, you never had lunch. So he would always want to be called for dinner. And my grandmother would say to my cousin, "All right, go get Walter for dinner. Now remember to call dinner, because if you told him it was lunch, he wouldn't come." He was very obstinate. He was as tough as nails. And my cousin and I, as we were little kids, we'd always go out and say, "Walter, lunch is ready," and then he'd run back in the house. he's not coming in here, and what are you kids up to? You know, oh, I think we said. But that old parrot was was like a person too, because sometimes about 11:30, 12 o'clock, you could hear, her name was Loretta, by the way. And you'd hear Loretta, she'd say, Walter, lunch, lunch. She'd laugh at herself. My grandmother would even get upset with that parrot, but that parrot did a lot of things like that with us. She was part of the family, and she lived till, you know, I guess about the time we were married back.
Did she swear?
Oh, yeah, well, we thought she was swearing some. My dad took Spanish when he went to high school and came home, and he said, yes, it was swearing, because she swore in Spanish. She was a Spanish sea captain for probably 50 years, and she swore very well, and she carried on the tradition. But we let her loose up in she was out in the back in the olive tree, and they'd open cage for her once in a while. She'd just climb all over that olive tree, cutting branches off with her beak, and you never want to get bit by her beak off there. It would really tear something out. But she was a character, it was a lot of fun, and people enjoyed her. Anything else? Well, that brings the history up to date, so now you all know, and tonight, when I call you, I want to hear the right answer. So you can pass the test.
At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Earle Duncan, in case you don't know him. And he's going to talk about his days in Clayton and I don't know what else. He's been digging up all kinds of things. So I'll turn it over to him right now, and don't run away after it's through. We have something else to do also.
Anyhow, there's one there, yeah, he was snuck in the back door. But anyhow, I'd like to talk tonight on the 8 years that I had gone to visit Mount Diablo Elementary School at the end of Pine Hollow Road. This two-room schoolhouse was served the Clayton area from 1863 till 1947. It was built on a 2-acre land provided by Joel Clayton for public school. The site is now part of the Mount Diablo Elementary School grounds. Enrollment was 41 in 1868, first year for which the figures are available. 111 in 1890 during Clayton's greatest period for the agricultural prosperity, and 13 when it closed. And the 8 years that I went there, I believe that about a mean average would be about 40 a year for all 8 classes in the school. They had 2 teachers, and this original school bell that some of the students arriving on horseback, wagons, or on foot now rings at the Mount Diablo Elementary School. Well, my sister and I and a bunch of children from Kirk Path on up used to walk to school there. And in the springtime and wintertime, we'd walk through all the grass and get our feet good soaking wet, so that we could go and take our shoes off and sit by the potbelly stove and, you know, do other things while the teacher took care of the other students, you know. And, but the bell would summon us into the schoolroom, we'd file in there, and we'd sit at our seats. The teacher would come in, we would stand, salute the flag, and then we'd all sing to the teacher. And I believe this is only in the first or fourth grade. I don't remember doing it in the big room. And this big room deal, the little room was first to the fourth, and the big room was fifth to the eighth. But we'd stand up and we'd all sing to the teacher, "Good morning, dear teacher, good morning to you." Have a happy birthday thing. And the teacher, the 8 years that I was there, is Mrs. Arnold, was taught the first to the fourth grade for all 8 years, and then years afterwards. And a teacher, principal from the big room, Miss Smith, was there 4 years, and then she left, and then Miss Dunn taught for another 4 years. And she taught, I was in her class for the 5th and the 6th grade, and then Miss Falk came, and she taught me in the 7th and 8th grade. And the class that I was in was one of the largest classes in the 8 years graduate. We had 7 of us. And there was Johnny Joaquin, Bob and Lillian Onstock, Betty Arnold, Bob Frank, cousin, Ronald Duncan, cousin, and myself. And games we played were baseball, and my uncle, Wil Frank, lived right next door there, and he would we'd come out to play ball recess time. He'd be out cultivating, he'd just drop the reins on the horse, climb over the fence, and he would play ball with us, or he would be the umpire, or if we needed, he would do the pitching, or whatever, you know. And we'd go ring the bell, and we'd go back into the schoolhouse, and he'd go back to cultivating, come out for recess again, and do the same thing. You know? Then lunchtime come, he'd come over and get a sandwich, you know. Then he'd say, "Come on, let's play some more ball." So then, in the springtime, when the grass got real green and thick on the side hill there, we'd go down to the store and get a bunch of cardboard boxes and stuff, and sometimes we'd get a piece of corrugated iron, make a sled out of it, and slide down the grass, you know. Go clean into the creek sometimes, you know, if you're heavy enough, and I was pretty heavy. And still there, you know. And the other games were marbles, football. And football, we played tackle, but those rocks were pretty hard, you know. But they had a lot of iodine and hydrogen peroxide. They had a closet full of hydrogen peroxide and cotton, you know. And girls played jacks mostly, and jump rope, and hopscotch, and anything I'm forgetting here. Anybody remembers? Just feel free to step in and say so. But we'd go, boys would go out in the outhouse and tell jokes and stuff, you know. And somebody would snitch on them, or the teacher would sneak up and she'd be outside and listen to us, or maybe we'd cussing. And boy, that was it. She'd kiss all in there and wash her mouth out with soap. It was liquid soap. And that, you only done that once, you know, and you saved all your cussing and jokes from walking home from school, you know. The teacher wasn't going to be around to catch you doing that second time. So, another little deal, one day we were out there, and beautiful spring day, and we were wondering what we could do, noontime. And I said, we had an idea, so we went to the supply room, and every boy got 2 or 3 rolls of toilet paper. We went to the outhouse, and we unrolled them all the way down. And they were the PWA, public work outhouses, you know, and they had a vent on it like a stovepipe. So we just rolled all this toilet paper down there. And when the school bell rang, well, some of the boys smoked, you know, and we lit a match and threw it in the outhouse, went back in class, and so then pretty soon somebody would get up just teacher, the outhouse is on fire. She'd get up and look out, oh, wow, you big boys go out and take care of it, you know? So we go out there and spend the rest of the afternoon playing in the outhouse. And that was good practice for my future career as a firefighter. Helped out a lot. I got the education at Mount Diablo Elementary. And a few of the kids had their bicycles, not too many, but this George Coletta had this real nice bicycle with a balloon tire thing, shiny and everything. And my sister loved to ride it. And boy, she beat George out to that bicycle every recess, and she'd ride around that thing, and nobody else had a chance to ride the bicycle. So I don't know what happened. One day she was out there riding this bike, and the snake started coming out of the handle. And man, the bike and Margaret and the snake split right there. And she never touched George's bike again. So, we used to have, trade lunches. We had lunch period, and we trade lunches, and we got to taste different varieties of food. And this one fella, some of the kids in town, they used to go home for lunch. Other times, they would bring it when their mother weren't going to be home. They'd bring their lunch, bag lunches, and we'd take bean sandwiches and tuna sandwiches and egg salad sandwiches and. Yeah, they were all good sandwiches, but we'd like to trade. So this one fella, he'd come once in a while, Albert Biaggi was his name. He lived with his aunt. And so my mother, I come home one day and she says, oh, I forget now what she put in there, but I don't know what she asked me. How do you like your lunch? I said, I didn't eat it. She said, you didn't eat it? I said, no, I traded the sandwich for Albert Biaggi. She says, well, what was it? I said, well, it was an Albert Biaggi sandwich. And she says, well, what's an Albert Biaggi sandwich? She said, I said, I don't know. It was very good, though, And so, the next PTA meeting or something, the next time she went uptown, she saw Rosie, and she says, Rosie, what do you give Albert Biaggi in his sandwich? She says, Helen, Albert very seldom he comes home for lunch, but when I do, it's usually a fried egg. A fried egg? Yeah. So she came home, she said, Earle, was that a fried egg in the Albert Biaggi sandwich? Could have been. I said, go ahead and make me one. I'll try it. So she cooked one up. Yeah, that's an Albert Biaggi sandwich, huh? So then I had the Albert Biaggi sandwich. And the PTA used to serve warm lunches in the wintertime about once a week. And the mothers, they'd take turns. And they'd be, make spaghetti, and they'd have bread. And then maybe a pot of beans, and sometimes they'd make cornbread or bread, they'd have bread or biscuits or something with beans, stews, all kinds of stuff, And it was really good. The kids really liked that. And one of the first holidays, kind of a holiday, one of the outings of the year was Halloween. And the first Halloweens that I remember, later on, they were transferred to the Christian Endeavor Hall down in Clayton, but the first ones were held up in the schoolhouse. And they used to have a contest for the best pumpkin, decorated pumpkin. And the mothers, PTA mothers, would participate in this program. And Tootsie, Alma Frank, she would dress up as a witch, and had a big witch hat, and had a big clay nose and wart on the end of it and everything. And we'd go in there and sit around the stove there, the wood stove, and she'd tell all spooky stories and stuff, and it scared the hell out of us, And then it'd be over with, and they'd have the bobbing for apples. They'd have these big wash tubs full of apples, and they'd have pennies in them, and nickels, and sometimes they'd even a dime, And 4 or 5 kids, you get around that tub to get in those apples, and you get an apple with a dime on, man, you chase that sucker clean to the bottom. There's bubbles and everything else coming out. People were wet, and we had a lot of fun. And the fellows, some of the fathers, in the afternoon, they dug a trench out in the schoolyard. And then about 4:30 or so, they filled it with oak wood and set it on fire. And so then later on, after the the games and stuff were done inside. We'd go out there and they'd cut some willow sticks and then give us hot dogs. And we'd barbecue our own hot dogs, and we have hot dogs and buns, hot dog and mustard. And the mothers had hot cocoa. And then after that, well, then they'd give us these marshmallows, you know. Well, every kid would have put the marshmallow on the end of the stick, and they'd stick it in there, and they'd leave it in there till the damn thing got on fire. Then they'd start figuring out that they'd have marshmallows on fire in everybody's hair, face, and everything. So that was the Halloween. Later on, the Halloween parties down at the hall were a little different. There was one that they had a stage down there, and they had petitions. They made cardboard petitions, and it's all dark and spooky. They blindfold you, and they'd have bowl full of spaghetti that was cold, and oh, there's the brains, you know. And have your hand in another bowl of olives and oil or something, you know. These are eyeballs and all that stuff, you know. But it was a lot of fun. And the PTA did a lot for the children. And then the Christmas party, it was a great thing all the time too. We put on plays, and there's a program here. One of the last ones that Melvin Gomez, I guess, had it and brought it over to Connie and had a Duke or Dick or somebody. And it the last play I think I was in there. And we really enjoyed it. We put them on every year. And the first grade the first little room put on a play, and then the big room also. They had double plays. And in between, other children would get up and read, maybe recite poems or do a monologue. And then after that, they have a Christmas tree. Some of the fathers had gone up on the mountain and got a big tree, put it up there, just a big old bull pine. And we weren't used to the real fancy looking trees here, but they sure smelled good. It smelled like a Christmas tree, you know. And they decorated it real nice. And the Kellers used to buy candy, this hard candy, and all the oranges. They used to buy gifts and stuff for the children there, the Lodi and Harry Keller. They had no children of their own, but they're real good to the kids in the community. And basically, the graduation play was much similar to, we'd practice for, 5 or 6 weeks, I guess. In the last 4 or 5 days, we'd go down, the little room would go down in the morning and practice, and the big room would go down in the afternoon and practice at the Endeavor Hall. And then the last day, we'd go down and put on a dress rehearsal. And then that night, we'd go all out and put on a big party, and everything was fine. We had a lot of fun doing that. And at one time, I remember the PTA mothers got together, and they put on a play, and it was the craziest thing you've ever seen. But it was a lot of fun. And a lot of the mothers, they decided, and Carmen was in on this too, right here. She's going to teach us club-footed guys not to step on the girls when they're dancing on their feet, trying to do anything. And they had quite a time. We'd go down there and practice that dancing and stuff. We all had a good time. I did, anyhow.
Well, I just played the piano.
And yeah.
Did the teacher?
Yeah, we played the piano. And we done a great time. And then twice a year, my uncle, he was the superintendent and foreman for the Cattle Company. And every fall and every spring, they'd drive the cattle, up through Marsh Creek from the John Marsh ranch down there. And Uncle Bart would come up with his pickup and he'd say, well, fellow teacher, now keep the children inside because the cattle are coming up the hill about 11:30 this morning, There won't anybody get hurt. So, boy, we all wouldn't stay inside, we'd get out on the porch, And so some of the kids would look out the window. But that was quite a thing to see the cattle coming and going, that was twice a year. And it killed a little time in the classes and stuff. And then every time an airplane run over, everybody ran outside. Keep it on, ringing the bell, ringing the bell. And finally everybody get back in the schoolhouse. And then every summer we had this in the school picnic, the school picnic. And Henry Frank and Lily Russellman Frank would donate the Russellman Park for the school picnic. And then PTA again would get up there and they'd have all the lunches and everything ready for us. But Benny Correa Levito, he used to haul us in his cattle truck, and it was kind of a exchange deal because one year Benny Correa would haul us in his cattle truck, and the next year was the Coletto, Don Coletto had the cattle truck that would haul us, you know. And but boy, we just enjoyed riding in the cattle truck because we'd go to school, and then here comes the truck, and we get up there and we'd sing and holler all the way up the Russellman Park Road, and we get out there, we swim and have a picnic and everything. A lot of the mothers was, oh, come on, come home with me, you know. Oh no, we got to ride back in the cattle truck, you know. So then the mothers had to come back down to the school and pick their children up, because everybody wanted to ride in that cattle truck. And, well, I don't know, it was a lot of fun, and there's a lot of people had some success out of it. I think we all did. I don't know too many that didn't, you know. But there's Lois Frank Rasmussen, Jean McGuire, and Marie Frank Larson became teachers, and Ronald Duncan became a veterinarian. And there's Ronald's wife, Naomi, back here, and his daughter, Linda, we're right here. Yeah, we're here tonight. Glad to have you here. And Ronald passed away some time back, and we should miss him. But the last year at school, this new Miss Fogg, she wanted to have a harmonica band or something, you know. She wanted to know if anybody was interested in it. So there's about 8 of us, I guess, got decided, well, we're going to try this harmonica band. And so Miss Fogg said, well, okay, well, I'll go down and buy the harmonicas, and I'll let you know what they cost. So a day or so later, she'd come back. She said, well, I got the harmonicas, and they're going to run about 35 cents a piece. And that was for about a 10-reed M. Horner harmonica, which today runs about $15, I think. And so that was fine. So we went to these harmonica lessons about half hour after school, and it was once or twice a week, and it went about 4 or 5 weeks, and then people kept dropping out and dropping out and dropping out, and finally there were only 2 of us left. It was Bob Onstop and myself. But Bob, he came out from Oklahoma, and he already knew how to play the harmonica. He was helping everybody else how to play it, you know. And so Bob used to walk home with us, and so he and I kind of kept it up a little bit. He taught me a little bit about it. So, in closing tonight, I'd like to play a little harmonica for you. My wife picked this up. It's about the smallest she could find, so it is a little harmonica. I'll give it a whirl. Thank you very much. Here you go, Carmen. No, I'm sorry, I had a sound like Columba here now, coming back. I had a little gift here for Lucy Vieira. Last month, or month before last, the end of the last month before last, I was shopping for a card for my sister, and birthday card, and we kind of go all out on these cards, not much on present. They're real cutload cards. And so I was down at the mall, and I found a schoolhouse, the charm thing. And it looked like the old Clayton school, you know? And so I got it, and it had the chimes on it were the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, you know? And So I went and we bought it, and Helene got up there and she says, the woman says, well, oh, is this for a teacher? And what do you call him? Helene said, no, it's for his sister, for her birthday. And she said, oh, do you realize this is a teacher's gift? I said, yeah. Well, my sister taught me a lot of things. I figured, well, she deserves a teacher's gift. But I got to thinking of it, and I got to thinking this program was coming up, and there was another one there, so I bought it for Lucy, and I was going to give it to her tonight, Lucy Vieira, but for the oldest living graduate from Mount Diablo Elementary. So I'll have to see Lucy, I'm going to give it to her, okay?
Any questions?
Any questions?
Before he disappears, what relation to you was Hat Duncan that used to live on Houser?
A cousin,
Okay.
cousin, yeah. My mother and him were first cousins.
Okay, and did you know a firefighter in Concord by the name of Whitey Klaus?
Whitey Cloud, yes, I did. Yep. Oh, yeah? Yeah, I knew Whitey Cloud. Yeah. Any other questions?
Earl, tell us about the house up the end of Alberta Way. A lot
Oh,
of people that don't know the house is there, if it's still there, but tell us about the house up the top of Alberta.
yeah. That was the Duncan Ranch up there at the end of Alberta. And, well, there's the one further on up, but up to the first gate was the Duncan Ranch. And my great-grandmother, she lived to be 101 years old, and we used to go there on Sundays, about every Sunday, to go see her. And I remember her laying in bed, and she had a nightcap on, you know, and she had a big milk glass pitcher and wash basin there, and a real fancy thunder mug, powered painted thunder mug under the bed, you know. So I'd go and get a pillow, you know. I mean, I'd go and sit on the end of her bed, you know, and she'd throw the pillow at me and knock me off the bed. So I'd go and pick it up and walk back up and hand it to Grandma. Go back and sit on the bed. She'd throw it and knock me. She was a pretty good bowler. But she must have thought I was really a dumb ninny. You know, come and pick it up and bring it up and give it to her. But that lady, you know, is hard to get liquor at the time. But my dad knew where to get it, and everybody else in Clayton knew where to get it. But she'd say, better than me, she'd give him a quarter, you know. Better than, would you give me a spot of brandy? Would you give me a spot of brandy? And so he'd go and get her a bottle of brandy, and she kept it under her pillow. And but that ranch, I don't know if it's all still there or not, but it was in one of the first ranches the Duncans had. And my dad, his mother passed away when she gave birth to him, and his father passed away with the influenza when he was 8 years old. So there isn't much history that I know of, you know, in the Duncan family. But my sister has some papers and stuff, and we're going to dig into it, but her husband had a bypass last Tuesday. So, but he's doing well. He's down there tonight. So that, I don't know, that's about the end of that, I guess.
The house is occupied now.
House
We
is
met the gal
occupied,
that
yeah.
lives in it, yeah.
Yeah, it's been sold, I think, 2 or 3 different times, you know. But this Mr. Angelo Cuneo here, he went across to school across the street, the one-room schoolhouse in Cowell, and his father thrashed grain, and they used to thrash grain on that ranch, you know, when it was ready, yeah. So we play cards every Tuesday night, Coolies and the Duncans. Last Tuesday night, the storm knocked the lights out, and their son Bob went and got some candles. We each had a candle. We sit there and finished playing video. Any other questions?
Did you ever set the hill on fire when you slid down like they did, years ago?
No.
You'd have to.
No.
Yeah, the fire department would be out there, but they'd only put the fire out. They wouldn't let the whole hill burn.
Yeah.
The kids would slide down on cardboard.
Yeah,
Dry
right.
grass,
Yeah.
friction would set it off.
Yeah. No, that was a lot of fun sliding down. Oh, and there was another thing I forgot, is the stilts. We used to make stilts and walk on those stilts. And that was kind of in the springtime or wintertime when the creek was running. And we'd go down there at noontime, and then no doubt in your mind who was the winner, because the loser came back soaking wet. One or the other off. Yeah, Linda?
Yeah, did you grow up in that white house that Helen used to live in? And
No.
if not, where did you grow up?
I grew up, oh, let's see, right on the corner of Ignatia Valley and Clayton Road. And I'm in that area where that Lucky Store is, and Longs and that stuff, you know, a little closer to this end, you know. Yeah, but my mother was born in that other house, the Joe Franks, on Kirkwood Pass, where the Safeway store is now. My mother was born in there, yeah, in that house.
So the old Duncan house is still there, is that what you said?
What's that?
You said the old Duncan house at the end of Elbert is still there?
I think it is, yeah.
You have to show it to me.
I haven't, yeah, exactly. Been a while since I've been up there, so. Been retired 18 years, I don't get around much anymore. Any other questions? Okay, how many people in here went to this Alto school, elementary school? There we go. Fred Blocken, Dorinda, Romana, George, Willie, Majora.